Hey, what's up, everybody? My name's Ryan. Welcome to the High Feature. I've given some brief introductions to my channel, and I've also posted a video that I was talking about Ascension. I want to get more into the Ascension process, right? And I'm going to explain a little bit of how I kind of aggregated all this information. So it's probably about 20 years, well, maybe 25 years of analytical study done on all the different religions. And what I've come to understand is the self-similar patterns that are within them. And I've looked across mythologies, insider testimony. I interviewed Dr. Miller for my website, the High Feature I had about 7 years ago, 8 years ago. But what was going on with me, I didn't really understand. And when I did do that interview and started that website, I triggered a series of events that led to the conclusion seen in the original video I posted, Revelations, because I wasn't aware of the nature of our existence here on Earth and what's really going on here. And I really wasn't aware of why I was so attracted to the religions either. But I'm going to give you the information that I learned so I can hopefully be of a benefit to everyone. Now, the divine intelligence is mentioned in many different faiths, and we can understand it as the Holy Spirit in Christianity. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, no, it's God, but God is a very different thing. Okay, and I can get into that in some later episodes, but I want you to just step away from God for a minute and all of that and look at the Holy Spirit as this cosmic divine energy that is responsible for all things. And I liken it to also Allah, the infinite all, the logos, the great mystery, the 10,000 things, the great perfection. I call it the Creator's dream cloud. And the way that I've come to envision it for myself is that what we're existing in is a giant mind that's dreaming, and we're self-similar fractals of it. So we possess soul and we possess intelligent infinity. So what is intelligent and infinite about ourselves? Our imaginations, right? So with your imagination, I want you to imagine that you're inside a giant cloud. That's like something similar to what would be coming out of a cell phone tower, or like the surface of a DVD. So you can't see the movie, but you can see the information, and all of it exists at once. The past, the present, and the future, all contained as a whole in a position that is outside of time relative to you. But the way that the mechanism for interpreting this information is your biology. So you have neurological centers in your gut. That's responsible for gut feelings, right? And then you have neurological centers in your heart, and that's responsible for the most powerful feelings. The most powerful creation force is in the heart. And then you have all the thoughts that you have in your brain, but the brain has plasticity, and then the way that you train your brain entrainment. We're going to go into Dr. Miller where he talks about that. The way that you train your brain, the things you think about, the behaviors you do are firing neurological circuits, okay? So your ability to receive this information and interpret it is also correlated to how you're living your life. So the way that the creation works is, as a fractal fragment, there's a path of souls, okay? So that's about you in the future, because all we ever really can be is a self-perception, experiencing a state of being in the present moment, right? That's all anything, anywhere is, and then we're all relative to each other. So you guys are in your position of existence relative to me, right? I'm in my position of existence relative to you. So that makes us relatives, right? And then the Native Americans talk about all our relations, but that gets more complicated because the nature of humanity is complicated. And there's so much stuff to talk about, and it's all in the religions, all right? It's all in the religions, how we came to be, who the players are, but it's coded very carefully. And it's hard to see it. It's a big lesson, right? So I'm not going to go into that yet. I want to focus on the practical application of how you use your biology to interpret these fields, right? Because there's a non local aspect to all of us. So I exist right here in reality, but then to you, when you see me or you see this video, you're watching a recording of me, but then you're going to think about me and to hear about me at some point, and then to access that memory, that piece of me, you're real time accessing this composite of information that's stored non locally that's responsible for me. And that's how we get feelings about one another, right? So when you have a telephone call, oh, I was just thinking about you, and then the person calls. That's an example of the non-local mind working together in a morphic resonance where we're all sort of hooked up, and when you get out onto the highway, that's what you're experiencing in traffic when you guys, everybody's such aware of each other and you're in this sort of flow of consciousness unity that you're experiencing driving, right? It's just an example. Or, someone can put their eyes on you and you can feel it. Another thing where you're getting information from your biology about something that's occurring non-local to you, and there's a mechanism of communication and intelligence between you and the environment that would seem to be like paranormal or supernatural, right? But it's not. It's natural. It's why we exist, right? And that's sort of what the capacity of our biology is. So when it comes down to this ascension stuff, okay, you're existing inside an experiment. Now that might be hard for a lot of people to take or understand, but the nature of our civilization is that we came into being as an experiment, and it was being hosted for the purposes of this ascension. Because what happens, and I'll explain about the galaxy. If you saw my other videos, you understand that as a fractal, we're fragments of the galaxy, and then we can look at ourselves to understand the galactic mind. And the way the galaxy works is it goes through growth cycles, and other cycles have occurred before ours. And the way to think about it is like brain structures, how you have a reptilian brain, an old mammalian, a neocortex, and then a prefrontal cortex, and how each structure is sort of built on the next. Well, that's the concept for the galactic mind in a way, where they have a growth era, and in that growth era, a large cycle is completed and everything goes through its development, and then based on the learning and growth in that, it moves to the next, and it's sort of evolving as it's following pathways and patterns through its own life cycle, and it brings us all up into being. But there's an aim and intent, because as I was saying, you're always like a person in the present moment, right? A state of being in the present moment. So the aim and intent is for who you will be in the far-flung future over a natural pathway of evolution. And then at certain stages, the development is different. So the genetics that are on Earth are from an earlier stage than what we're experiencing now. And they've been aggregated together because they possess qualities that allow you to have what would be considered ascended abilities, right? The ability for telepathy, the ability for increased healing factor, the ability for empathy, the ability for grand states of benevolence and compassion, our ability as creators to perceive and see the creation in a certain way, because then that will then unlock potentials that wouldn't exist for beings that don't have those centers. So what's gone on in Earth is a hodgepodge of various genetics from around our galaxy were aggregated together for an experiment, and there was multiple beings involved. So there was a race of guardians that lived on the asteroid belt. That was a planet called Tiamat. It's not the asteroid belt, but it was called Tiamat. It's now the asteroid belt. They came from Pleiades system as colonists, and they went through a golden era where they were contacted by Ra, Vivaswan, the archangels, or the ancients, and they were relayed the law of one, which is also the transcendental knowledge or Islam. And it's a benevolent, loving religion that's based on love and kindness, and it's the most ancient philosophical perception about the creation. And the thing is Manu's and Pleiades system, and at their stage of development millions of years ago, they weren't aware that this was the nature of the creation. And then what occurred was various contacts, and this information was relayed to Manu. And then, well, that's what they're called in the Vedas, but Manu's also Anu, Odin, Jeb, the Watchers. And this information was relayed to him, and they received it and spurred a golden era, and they were master geneticists. And another genetic farmer race that was outside of our star system, outside of our star cluster, had aggregated these genetics together. And Manu, who was the guardian of our star system, actually worked with them in the first creation of beings 500,000 years ago. And it was an add-in into a surface experiment that was evolving. And they came to Earth 500,000 years ago, and that era ended in some epic war and destruction. And they then went back to their satellite, which was Marduk, that orbited Tiamat, and it's now Mars. And then 55,000 years ago, in their final act, so to speak, they left Mars and then crash landed the benevolent surface experiment that was occurring, that they were aware of, that they had a hand in earlier, because they're working with these higher density beings. And they were following the law to a certain degree, but then their final act of crash landing into it sort of brought us to where we're at. And it was a feminine dominant, benevolent ascension experiment that was a unity consciousness. So that's also in the Quran, where they talk about how we were a unity humanity, and then we were broken into variants. And it's in the Vedas as well, how Manu came here and progenerated mankind and made men. And then they hoaxed a golden era. The reason why I say hoaxed is because they took all their knowledge of millions of years of living in the light, and then they raised their people into it and created a golden era, and then they inserted their chosen one. And then that was the newborn soul of the archangels Ra or Vivaswan, given to Manu for contacting them and entangling them into the mess they were, because they were basically very hurt by it. You know, it was, they felt abandoned and forsaken by these benevolent beings that displayed themselves to them, because you're not supposed to do that. And in doing that, it created the entanglements in the progression to where we're at. So that gives you an idea of the genetics you have. All right, you have an insanely powerful genetics that gives you're basically like these ancient forest guardians that are supposed to be so loving and benevolent and kind. And then when you see like a puppy or a baby, it's supposed to be like, that is like, ugh. And you're not supposed to be saying bad words, eating animals, doing all the bad stuff we're doing, right? By our nature. And then there's an ancient crystal left by Ra that was 3, and the fall of Atlantis precipitated out the loss of 2. But the crystals themselves are like glow sticks for a bygone era. And then their presence here is what brought Manu to Earth and others, because it's a very ancient and powerful technology. And when they came here and they found these crystals, at first they were following the law as guardians, you know, and they protected it. But eventually they fell into doing experiments and things they weren't supposed to do, and that entangled them and created a rift between them. But that's like a glow stick from a bygone era. And what that does is it changes the light of consciousness. So everybody on Earth, if we weren't, you know, contaminated the way we are, would be living in a unity, and we would be guardians and caretakers, and we would be following service to others modalities. And service to others modalities is when you're not aligned to service to self. So you wouldn't have things like money and corporations and war and weapons and all that stuff. It would be a completely different mode of being that the entire planet would be in. And that was the aim and intent for Manu, but they hijacked it for themselves because they, being given the transcendental knowledge, went to their heads, and then over a period of time, they forget and they fall because you reincarnate, right? You're animate out of a singular intelligence field that is exploring itself through patterns and pathways, which is us in the present moment. And then we get out and do our work and our learning, and we condense once we learn these higher lessons. So that's what changing density is. It's becoming less patterns and pathways following lower modalities into larger, more dense beings that are following fewer patterns and pathways that are orientated towards higher modes of being in order to tap your biology to attenuate yourself to these fields. Because it's literal, right? There's an operating system of consciousness and awareness that we're all a part of. And we're processing to be something in the present moment, right? And Manus and the fallen guardians understood that, so they wanted to take the genetics here, splice themselves into it, and then hoax it for themselves, because they were doing a service to self pattern because of what had happened to them, you know. And then they came and they inserted their chosen one, and that precipitated out the fall of Atlantis. So that would be like Thor, Asgard, and Ragnarok with Surta. Surta would be the solar event. Ragnarok was the destruction of it. And Thor, or Osiris, or Matsya, depending, because you can go to Egypt, you can go to India, you can go to Northern Europe, and it's all the same. Similar, not the same, so similar. And he opens a portal to the dark dimension. Now that would be the Jinn race. They become the Jinn race in Islam, or it would be the Archons. I'm not sure what exactly that's from, on the top of my head right now. But what ends up happening is that dark waveform comes in, and then it gets people in another dimension. It slaves them. And then even though that portal got closed by Surta, the Flash, what ended up happening was it remained and it contaminated the Earth's consciousness field. And then people that are enslaved by it keep reincarnating as its slave, and it's basically controlling the path of souls because it's this like uber evil intelligence field that's outside of time. Sort of the worst possible scenario for everybody is what kind of came through, and then it precipitated out a fall, and then they went from 24,000 years ago to about 14,000 years ago, maybe 13, and they inserted the 200, and then the 200 took the bloodline of the Avatar, the newborn soul of the ancients, and then they incarnated Narasimha, which is the beast man, and that was a brutal era, and they were making abominations, and then they show you that in the science fiction. So now science fiction is not that. It's called predictive programming, soft disclosure. You're an experiment. So none of this stuff is coming to you organically. You're not inventing it. You're not coming up with it and creating it. It's being disseminated into your consciousness by the beings that created you because you're an asset for them, because you're the fallen continuity of species plan for the Manu, the guardians of the transcendental knowledge in our star system, that was taken over by their enemies. And then their enemies would be the reptilians and the insectoids and the greys that are in the outer rim of the galaxy, because our star system was encapsulated in a barrier, and that barrier allowed these beings not to come in, and they wanted in because it was the most coveted star cluster in the galaxy because of the archangels Vivaswan or Ra and their philosophical religious perspective of the law of one, or Islam, or the transcendental knowledge. So because of how they did their work, they created these insane relics, right? That were super powerful, and everybody who is a nefarious evil being is trying to get their hands on them to figure out how to operate them or all these different things. It was a coveted area. It was protected, and then they entangled the Manu to basically grow them into the guardians that they were. And then the Manu did what they did on their way out. They were in a fallen state, and they used the relics to obliterate these reptilians, and they bought themselves some time, let me tell you. But it didn't matter. They had their chosen one that was supposed to lead their people, and that didn't work. And then they got frozen under the ice, and then the reptilians eventually got control of their experiment, the continuity of species plan. But they had made agreements with other beings long ago, and then those other beings ultimately would be the interdimensional race that is known to the Air Force as the Edens, right? The extraterrestrial biological entity. They, you see them in science fiction with Ant-Man and stuff. They're the ones that aggregated the genetics and brought them to Earth. So that's sort of like the backstory on why you have these religions and what this is all about. They're trying to teach you about your capacity to activate your biology so you can have these super ascended abilities and then join all your relations. That's why this time period is called the harvest. So you would be able to go and be with all your relations, right? But now that gives you an idea of what kind of biology you got. So now it comes down to the nitty gritty, right? The part of actually like getting your biology active. So the analytical study component is like being able to understand how you're in a dynamic with this non-local intelligence field that has brought you up into being and has an aim and intent for you. And the mechanism for understanding it is through yourself, right? Thus, self-work. Okay, so self-work has to do with like, okay, well, who am I? What am I doing here? Why am I the way I am? Why do I have this problem? Why do I have that problem? Why am I attached to this? Why do I have an aversion to that, right? Because that's what was going on with me. I was trying to find out what was going on, right? Because I was having like these really unexplainable symptoms of a hardcore nightmare. And I was entangled into drugs, in alcohol abuse, in the worst position. I was in military service, stuck there, being abducted and abused, or having them come in my home. They would use various technologies. There was voice of God technology, some sort of string puppet technology. There would be times I go missing out of my home and couldn't be accounted for hours in the night, and would be freezing cold. So they were doing that, and it was hardcore. But I would have the symptoms, but the way that I got to it was through self-work, right? Working on myself, and then I ended up having that event on those days where a bunch of spacecraft came to my house. And you can see it on my channel. I have hours of video of it. But what I was doing was I was inside an abuse op, and I didn't know, but what I was doing was following the spiritual protocols in all the various religions. So I didn't just take one, I was open to all of them. And I was like, I'm going to look for the best parts and like the things that come in the most to it. And then the things that come to the practical application easiest, right? So basically, the easiest thing to understand is what they're saying is that it's how you do your work in your present moment, and you can be working and not working. So it's like what your aim and intent is. So if you make your aim and intent all about money and the aggregation of wealth and all these things that are these materials, then you're actually kind of doing nothing. But because you're valuing that and you're in a field dynamic with this intelligence, and you think that has value, reality will coalesce around that. And you will do your work in that way, and it will seem like you're being fulfilled. and it will seem like everything is going great, but ultimately you'll not be cultivating the soul. And then you could have your life a certain way and you would not be able to be convinced it was any other, but ultimately you're going to recycle and reincarnate, and you're not going to be in the same position you were in this life. Things might get more difficult for you, or it might get easier depending if you're working on the Creator's aim and intent, right? So it has to do with how you do your work. And it's as simple as the feeling you keep in your body as you do your day. And then your ability to have mindfulness to the thoughts and feelings. The things you're thinking about, the things you're feeling, right? The things you're talking about. The relationships around you, right? How they feel. What comes up when you see certain people. Why you feel the way you feel. Right? It's all about finding your inner spot and working on what's wrong with you so you're not creating karma. So then what's karma? Karma is cause and effect. If I do this, then that, right? It's who you're going to be in the future, but you're in this field dynamic, right? So the way to think about the DVD is you're in this cloud, and then it's not just one DVD. It's a bunch, and each one is its own universe with a different version of you. And then the way you're navigating reality is by the choice making. So if I go down this door, right, I make this choice, and then this is what's the path I'm on. And then if I go down that door, I make this choice, and then that's the path I'm on. But then how do you know what's the right choice? How do you know what to value? Right? And then that's where it comes into the biological centers that I was talking about in your heart, in your gut, and in your mind. What they contain is a real-time processing experience with this non-local cloud that's containing all these different versions of you. So then that's where the self-work comes in, is because you find the thing that's like the lesson, and it's reflected all around you. You know, your lessons are reflected all around you, and you can feel, you know how you feel about yourself, and then you know what you avoid, and you know, you'll come to know your triggers. Because if you do the self-work, you'll say, okay, well, I have a huge aversion to this, right? And then I'm deeply attached to that. So why? You know? And then in that, you could say, oh, well, that's because I really feel this way. And then what can I do to change how I feel about it, to let it go, right? Or to do something different, or, you know, to forgive someone. So it could be like, well, my wife cheated on me 10 years ago. And even though I forgave her on the surface, I never actually forgave her. And there's always been these behavioral patterns that are associated with that cause this reoccurring problems in my relationship. Or it could be the other way, where you're the adulterer and then you don't forgive yourself, right? And then you have all of these other patterns the other way. Or it could be, you know, you got drunk and slapped your brother, right? And then you never ever apologized for it. And then whenever you guys see each other, there's always this sort of static, and then you don't want to apologize because 5 years before that happened, he hurt your feelings, right? And you never really addressed it. Those are the kind of things that's all inside you, and it's personal. But the reason why it matters, because it has to do with you in the future, right? So here's the best version of you on this side, and then here's the lowest version of you on the other side, and then there's all the choices in between. But in order to get to this best version of yourself, you have to find the lessons. Because when you learn your lesson, you grow, you make a different choice. So you go down a different path. Because you're a real-time processor in the present moment. That's what you've been blessed with, is existence. And then you have this super high-powered biology where you can tap these super abilities by how you're doing your work, what you're aligning yourself to. So that's the first thing, is you do the self-work to get yourself where you feel okay, right? Where you're not stressed out, you're not in conflict with others, You're not accumulating karma. You're not in a cycle of abuse, right? You're not in a cycle of self-abuse. And then you're eating clean. So that's the first thing you got to do is you got to work through all your BS, and then you got to stay away from the bad food. So I don't want to scare people, but there's a bunch of satanic demons on earth, and they harm people and they do bad things. And then they're taking aborted fetuses and they're adding human material into the food supply. Okay? And there's lots of it in the processed foods. It's hard to fathom, right? But it's a prevalent problem. It's also researchable where you can, oh, there's DNA in Big Mac. There's 10% human material in veggie dogs and burgers, and all of them that they pulled off the shelf in the USA and did a chemical analysis or biological analysis, and they came up with human organics in these foods. So if you're eating that, then your ascension process isn't going to happen for you. It just won't. Because as soon as you eat it, you're a real-time biological processor in a present moment, and there's versions of you. So if you're continuously eating all this garbage, then you can't get the thoughts, feelings, and everything you need to do to jump to this version of yourself on this timeline here. And then on that timeline here, you jump to this one, you see? Because it's about what you're doing with yourself in the present moment. So then you take your dietary needs, and you do your proper work on that, right? So you get your diet well, you get your water well, and then you get your stuff sorted out, and then you start practicing the psionic abilities, right? The psychic capacities, the ability to activate those higher capacities, the non-local mind, right? And then that's where you'll introduce into the gates of the body, so the chakras, right? And then your torsion fields. So you get into like a meditative sort of state where you're doing body awareness, right? So anyone that's done any martial arts understands body awareness. And then if you've done Tai Chi, you understand Chi is acknowledging that there's an energetic force all around you and that you're a capacitor of it. And you have the ability to draw it in, put it into your body. You can put it into your hands. And then there's scientific research you can do to validate that with Viktor Gabrennikov and Wilhelm Reich. They did scientific studies where they talked about orgone or this other, I'm not sure what Gabrennikov called it, but he recognized there's an energy force, and he observed it with honeycombs and stuff. And then he started saying that like the human being can concentrate it in their hands, right? And then that's what Tai Chi is. You know, you're taking this natural ambient energy around you, and you're building a torsion field vortex with your biology, and you're drawing it in, right? And there's two places it enters your body, through the head and through the perineum, right? And you're bringing it in, and it's following the same sort of energetic patterns that other torsion fields are following. And then that's your main torsion field, and then you have the gates of the body. So you illuminate the gates of the body with knowledge, and then you can validate this scientifically with the research of Konstantin Kordakov and the GDV camera and the technologies that exist there, where they're diagnosing the chakras, and they're taking them and saying these people are in alignment, they're weak in these fields, and they're recognizing them as electromagnetic field vortexes, torsion fields. So there's a main torsion field, and then there's sub-torsion fields inside it, and all of it links up. Now, in the religions, it's like a mirror of Creator, right? And then that's why Manu and Ebens and other high-density races helped bring this vessel together for those chakras, because that energetic signature in our body is like the source signature. So the source signature has a similar resonance to what we are doing here, and then where we are in our position of light in the cycle is so far away from source. So the information the creator has organized is so that this is what these beings that have naturally evolved through their own existence would come together and do and create at this experiment. And we are like a mirror to this creator consciousness that's so far away, and then how we do our work polishes our mirror, and then we can reflect that light, right? Or you can draw it down into you. But it's about the loving service component, and it's about the behavioral modality shift, where you're no longer going to be orientated towards serving yourself. You're going to orientate towards service to others, and then you're going to try to eat real good foods, say real good things, be happy and loving and kind, right? But it's hard because there's a bunch of jerks out there, and then there's a bunch of people that don't want to hear what this. And when you talk about religions or you try to talk about it, they go no. And then you go to a family barbecue and you're trying to be helpful to people, they don't want to hear it. And they say, God, you're ruining my joy. But how happy are you when you don't know the truth, right? So you're operating under these illusions, consuming alcohol and bad foods, and then claiming that you're in a state of joy. And the religions define that. And they say that that's not what joy is. You're under an illusion and you're being a pretender, right? You think you're doing something, but you're not, and that's fine, and that's okay. You can do that, but you should also know where you're really at and what's going on, right? And that's the issue that comes up with people, is you can't really, we're all one in this group, right? And then everybody else is sort of pinging off each other, and there's all these people saying, oh, well, this is this way, that is that way, and then people get into arguments, and then everybody, it's just so challenging to have a real conversation about what's actually going on, and that plays a part because you're trying to exist and you want to cultivate your inner light. You want to perfect your beingness, but you have to do it in basically like insanity, and it's definitely something that will root you, and then the insanity will slow down. But you got to work on yourself to get there, right? So if you do like to eat the bad foods or drink the alcohol or party too much or have all these bad habits, but you are interested in, growing into being something more, then you have to do the self-work to eliminate all that and then change your perception, change your perspective so you can see like these things aren't healthy and they're not beneficial, right? Because then you can move into better states of being. So when you're dealing with the different stuff to activate your stuff, there's that, like, not the different stuff, but when you're dealing with the concept of the chakras, and to activate the chakras, you go to the logic that I was talking about with Konstantin Kordakov, and you look at it and you say, okay, this is something that's real. And then you work on body awareness, right? So when you get that tingly feeling, and when you learn something new, or I call it the oh shoot tinglies, and it comes when there's like those aha moments, when you're connecting with somebody, when you're doing something. So why is that occurring? Well, Dr. Miller told me it was DMT, and that what's going on is you're getting a little tiny burst of DMT in your brain because it's like, it's giving you a feedback loop, something that's saying, I like this, give me more of this, right? So that's what you do, is you look for ways to create those states of being regularly in your body, but then you also practice training it, right? You work on that feeling, and then you can create that feeling in your body, right? And then you're bringing the energy in, and you can feel the energy in your body, right? You can feel it in your nervous system, and then you can feel it in your chakras. And when your chakras aren't aligned, you can feel where they are. And then when you get the Kundalini fully up, into the pineal gland, that's when you're in the ascended state. That's when you're the full mirror of creator consciousness, and the creator's dream opens up to you. And that's where these abilities come from. That's why we have reoccurring avatars connected to the West's faith, right? So Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism are all connected to the newborn soul of the avatar, Benebdejed, right? That's a reoccurring avatar experiment where they've retrieved the genetics from the craft Oumuamua, and in that genetics, one contained the information for a whole soul, and they placed it into Osiris, Thor, or Matsya 24,500 years ago, and then it goes through a reincarnation cycle. And that avatar reoccurs, but because of the soul and the high density beings, it's being managed. And then you have in Asia, Padmasambhava and Lao Tzu, and they're both communicating some very similar things and displaying very similar traditions. And in those, they talk about some of this similar stuff to the Vedas, right? The bardos, those states of being, and that's sort of a part of where you can get into in your own consciousness exploration, right? Because what ends up happening once you start to really clear your body and being able to bring these feelings into the body and balancing them, you can start to do things like astral travel, and that's like the bardos that they mention in Tibetan Buddhism, and that's a great place. So the in-between state, they call it the mother light, right? So it's the in-between state when you fall asleep and before you go to deep sleep and before you're awake, that little tiny bandwidth of consciousness. If you can hold that space, then your ability for astral travel is huge. That's how you project out to the way you project. Once you achieve that sort of state, is all you have to do is think about things, right? And then you can remote view them. Now, for me, when I was in the military, I was doing this, and I talk about that in my Miller interview, where I would get out of my body, but I kept finding a bunch of goons because I didn't know that it's an experiment. And I didn't know that if you're like trying to do this, there's like a level of AI and evil beings that if you're targeted by them, they're there for you and they don't want you to leave. So I kept ramming into them, and I went to the Native Americans, and I did 4 years of spiritual training with them, and they taught me sweat lodge ceremony. And I was able to quit my bad habits and do all of this stuff, and that's what brought me to the Miller interview, right? But I didn't know what was going on, and I was doing that all on my own through my own analytical study of the religions. And then I got to Miller, and Dr. Miller taught me the biofeedback brain entrainment and put me onto some stuff that advanced me further in what I was doing. But I wasn't aware, but I mentioned those guys. And then later, it got into a pretty hardcore psychic fight that led up to the event that I recorded at my house. But the way that I was able to attain these states of being was through biofeedback brain entrainment. You just kept going to that feeling of like, okay, what gives me these feelings and what reinforces what I'm believing? It's like a confirmation bias, but you're doing like Kevin Bacon, but you're doing Kevin Bacon for the Ascension, for the Creator, across the religions, the insider testimony, and the science fiction mythology, and then the analytical study of everybody on planet Earth. So you go and you look at all the countries, everything that everyone's saying, and everything that's like forbidden. So you go to the Chinese energy medicine hospitals, right? You go to all of the stuff that Mao Zedong tried to destroy. You go to Russia, and you go to shamanism, and you go to all the stuff that Lenin tried to destroy, right? You go to the Native Americans, and you go to all the things that the United States of America tried to destroy, and Canada. And you take all of the information and the cultural beliefs and all of that, and you go through it and you look for the patterns that are self-similar, because then you're going to start to, like, your brain won't be able to say no. This is what it is. It's obvious, right? And then that's what occurs to you. All of a sudden, all you see is spirit, right? All you see is soul, right? To me, soul animates spirit, and then spirit is material, ego, all that, and then soul is the animating force of it, yin and yang, you know. But the thing that you do is you work on yourself, and then you go out and you look for all this information. So it's hard for a lot of people to think, man, I don't got 20 years, right? That's what I'm working on my channel. But you don't need to get into the details. It's simple, right? It's natural to you. But you need to understand that they're all talking about the same thing, because we're doing an experiment where they're trying to raise a group of humans into being these highly powered ascended beings in various different genetics from all around the galaxies, several, and in service to self and in service to others, have their genetics in us. So all our relations are literally our genetic relatives, and then they're in different positions of time flow. So some of them are existing in other dimensions. So from their position of existence, we're just a field, right? And they can plug in at any point in the movie. And then they're facilitating the nature of our present moment, right? They're relatives because their position of existence is relative to us, like space and time, right? So that's what's going on, is there's all these different people that have all these different beings that are related to us, you know, and that's what we're working on, right? So it's pretty complicated, but it has to do with you, your feelings, your emotional state, the things you're eating and drinking, and then the way you are with other people as you do your present moment, and what you're thinking about, what you're talking about, and who you're trying to become, right? And if you're trying to become more compassionate, more loving, more patient, and you're trying to understand the conclusive truth, right? And you're doing your analytical study in devotional service to Creator, then you're doing everything right.
You're talking about they're almost like the operating system for consciousness in a sense, right?
Gotcha. Now you're back in it. Yes, that's out of the Sephira, the Book of Formation.
Yeah.
And that's where numerology, gematria, related sounds to words, so that there was something more being conveyed, another layer, you know, besides just the word. It had a sound that had an auditory part to you, the word. That's where it all started, in the Sephira. Now, what then matriculated down into what we call numerology is now we have a base 10. Kabbalah, of course, had 22, and then they had certain numbers that were more important, like 11, 22, and 666. That didn't go down to 666. Would have been what is that? 6 and 6 and 6 is 18. Would be a 9. That doesn't work like that. You keep the 666 rather than making it a 9. And so the roles melt a way that you could relate sound to words. And so the earlier languages had less redundancy, if you catch my drift.
Yes.
Today we have metaphor and,
it's like the
automatopoeia, The
Tower of Babel, right? Like,
God
came down and screwed up our words.
And how to relate sound to words. That was what Hebrew was. That's where Greek started. The original Bibles were written in that, because the original Bible, QBL, means not written. It means word of mouth. And that means it was an oral tradition originally before they wrote it. And then when they started writing words, then it started losing essence because of the sounds related and so on. And then you had your babble, but, it's interesting. That's just a take on it. That's my physics and, trying to be spiritual and not sure where I'm going with it, but this is where I've led me at this point. I think there's some important things going on here and that we need to pay more attention to what we're doing and saying. Man is responsible for the words that come out of his mouth.
Oh, it's
you can't, there was a comic book called Mother's Oats, where it shows how a thought originates in some part of the brain, and by the time it goes through a bunch of train wrecks, it comes out different than how it started in the brain. Yeah, Mother's Oats, like during Yellow Dog and Zap Comics. It was called Mother's Oats, and it's on Jungian psychotherapy. Interesting comics, just like Predator.
So, you've talked about altered states. Like, I've had an opportunity to participate in some things, and from that perspective, and from the lens of physics, what is that reality that is capable for all of us to experience in relationship to me in this physical reality right now? It's kind of like the most bizarre place I think I've ever been. And it completely.
And how old are you?
Yeah.
It gets weird if you get older.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, but it.
Why? Why?
You don't like that weird feeling?
No.
Oh man.
It is weird.
Yeah.
It's sort of like you're hallucinating.
Yeah.
You're not saying. Yeah, it's not real. What you're doing is filtering and biasing and all kinds of creepy stuff where you change. I'm saying that as red. What do you think?
Yeah, I've had the opportunity, man, and like some of the things. It was so funny because when I did DMT, it was a place that I had never been, but was extremely familiar. You know what I mean? And I can remember some of the more negative things that I encountered that I had to face being with me from childhood, and I could remember having nightmares when I was a kid and then revisiting that place under the effect of the DMT and being able to make a connection as to where the fears were and everything else. But
what that's called in Jungian psychology, that's called revisioning. Okay. It's where you take your adult back to where the child trauma occurs and shows the child back then that the adult turned out okay, and then the adult and the child make an agreement to rewrite what actually is remembered on the experience. Wow. It's called revisioning psychology. That's James Hillman.
So there's huge health benefits for using these things.
That's right. It's all about health. That's correct. A way you choose to see what's going on. Like a glass half empty, you've lost something. Yeah. A glass that's half full, you've just gotten something. If the glass was half full of a yellow liquid, you could say it was full of piss.
Yeah.
And so, you have choices.
Yeah.
And so the way I trained SEALs was to come in with the idea that everything happens for a reason and everything leads to something better. And once they chose to look at that from that moment forward, they now were placed in the moment where their gut was, which is outside space-time. It's connected to who you were and who you will be. There's like a flow going through there. And now you're getting close to what Crowley called doing your true will. And if you think about it, doing the logic and using this part of the brain, you'll get you killed. Yeah. And so going back to your thing about my early childhood and working with the military, at the time I was doing it, I had no idea that I was doing it. SEAL Corporation didn't make any sense why they called it SEAL Corp, when in fact Navy SEALs didn't exist.
Yeah.
So how would I know I was a Navy SEAL and what that meant?
Yeah.
At that time, it wasn't real. It was just starting. Mm-hmm. And so that's how old I am. And I was in the middle of it, doing it like I am right now. And this right now part is talking directly to my future, which is changing my past. I could not have made it up better. Seal Corp out of Amherst. Where is that? It's not even Annapolis. How would I connect it with the military?
Yeah.
They were funding my ESP work.
So did you guys,
doing it to you?
Were you guys successful in, training these abilities in the candidates as you were developing them?
I don't know. What do you think? What about their history? What do you say about their history?
Yeah.
Their reputation seems to me like super soldiers kind of fit that bill. And it was toys. It wasn't changing their DNA and things like that.
Developing what they got naturally, right? It's what every human has within them.
We use toys like enhancement. How do I take someone that has not meditated ever and give him the brain of someone that is meditating for 30 years? How do you get there? Biofeedback. Okay. Brain drivers. That's how I did it. Brain entrainment. We force the brain in. It doesn't learn it as good as someone that's done it for 30 years, but it gets them there in 2 years.
Okay. So
in other words, Rick Strassman, some of the others that were doing studies, Persinger, the brain of a meditator is quite different than your or my brain. Mm-hmm. And brain drivers will bring your brain back to closer to that of a meditator, which is in bliss stage.
Yeah.
Now, we talk about love and the hierarchies of love, Eros, Philo, Agape, and Telema. And then we move to the next level above love, which is bliss. And there are jhana states of cosmic consciousness, these siddhas, these places of different layers of cosmic consciousness, like I experienced on that ridge with Timothy Leary. Mm-hmm. And where we ended up going was realizing there's another set of love and blisses above bliss, which is called joy. And that's one of the reasons why joy is so important, the word, in the Quaker forms of religion. It is when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing is where your joy is. And so you now have a key to discover what you're supposed to be doing because it's where you find joy. Now, joy is what you would be doing even if you weren't making money.
Yeah.
And that's where you go to seek. And it turns out, this is a difficult connection, but it's an important one, that your joy is what your value is to the human race. That means that after money and barter and tangs and whatever are gone, what you have to offer is what is your joy. That is what will evolve man. And that will be your most, when the grid goes down and you have no money in your pocket, what it is that you personally enjoy doing most, that just brings you more joy than anything else, stamp collecting, whatever, that will be your get out of jail card.
Wow.
And so that's why you want to start discovering that now, because that's going to be what you have to offer.
Mm-hmm. For me, through my experience with this stuff, I had to take a very practical approach to spirituality because I was, somebody that, I don't believe in any of that kind of stuff. I was kind of the atypical mainstream scientific viewpoint, from the quantum reality. Yeah, exactly. And very, very quick to dismiss others, but just through the own, my own process of saying, I want to be at a higher level, and looking at this, the development of your consciousness is the attentiveness to your thoughts, feelings, emotions, your dreams, your intuition, creativity, imagination, and you start fostering a relationship with these things, certain gifts do start to open up. There's times where I've been able to.
Ain't life, Brad.
Yeah.
It's a mystery, and the next moment is where the joy lies. Go for it. And when you have that lust for results, you're called inflamed. You're inflamed. That's a place. These are keywords in magic, in pathwork. When you have inflammation and you are exploding with.
So you're talking about in the morning, you wake up and you pay attention to how you feel, because that's kind of reflective of what type of archetypal figures you may have been
I wake up grumpy, and I'll reach over and turn the rheostat this way a little bit. So I've just changed my attitude.
Yeah.
Attitude adjustment, kind of like speed control. They have purpose and are tools to use you in navigating the good ship Lollipop.
So, and when you're talking about, changing states of consciousness, so if you can stay in a state of joy, in a state of bliss, even though there's tumultuous things happening around you, that state almost insulates you from the effects of that, conflict surrounding you, or?
Well, it doesn't insulate you. It changes their reason for existing. They're used.
That's it.
Like an opportunity.